Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition of the Best of Pedalshift. We are experiencing some production delays on your regularly scheduled episode, and so that will be coming out as a sort of a bonus later this weekend. But I do not want to leave you hanging on your typical Thursday listen. So here is a best of from the past and a really early episode.
On this edition, we are going back to March of 2015, and we're going to be covering probably one of those episodes that I should have split into two, but it was a jam-packed episode, and it's going to feature the two things in this best of because, frankly, it was pretty good stuff. It was gearing for dummies and critter protection. Two things that deserve their own episode, but I jammed into one. But good stuff in there. For the critter protection part, it talks all about the types of things that you can do to protect your food from critters and other things that smell, including things like bear boxes, how to elevate a bear bag, PCT style, lots of great stuff. Go check out the show notes at pedalshift.net/015. The second part, of course, is the gear talk, and we talk more about calculating gear inches and how important that can be for understanding how to make your bike a little climbier. And this was an excellent little bit of an overview. In fact, I did a follow-up episode years later, but this was the OG. This was the beginning one. Best of Pedal Shift, episode 015. Hope you enjoy. And on this episode, I wanted to talk about experiments in keeping food away from critters. For many of you who do a lot of camping, this probably won't apply so much if you're a bed and breakfast or a hotel type, a credit card bike tourist. No judgment. I think that's a totally cool way to do it. But if you're a camper, one of the things that you've got to deal with is making sure that your food doesn't end up in the belly of any of the variety of wildlife that's going to be surrounding you in your tent while you're out there camping. And I've had a little bit of experience. I had more experience camping than I have in bike touring, actually. And I'm combining a lot of my past experiments and my past experiences with you here on this portion of the lab. Let me start off by the number one thing. We don't want animals and we don't want insects and we don't want critters to get at our food for a variety of reasons. Number one, of course, we want our food for ourselves. We'll be selfish about that. Number two, it's bad for the wildlife. Number three, it's good for us as good stewards of these campgrounds to make sure that we leave no trace. It's a good camping aphorism. It's a good way to live, and it's what is asked of us at a lot of these variety of campsites. If you're wild camping, I think it's even more important because you really shouldn't be leaving any trace of yourself behind. It's just good stewardship, and it's being a good neighbor at the very minimum. So there's that. What we want to do then is we want to try to protect it as much as possible, but doing it in a way that is the least amount of work. So we want to try to find a good balance there. So for a lot of folks out there, I've noticed who are camping, and they seem to be a lot of first-time campers when they're out on bike tour. I've noticed I'll tend to see the most mistakes from people who are new to this. So that's why I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the fails that I've seen out there. Number one, which I would say is a major fail: keeping food in your panniers in your tent. That can work sometimes. And in fact, I'll be honest, I've done that a few times myself, especially if it's raining out or if there is a real lack of ability to get my food into more secure places, which we'll be talking about in a second. But I will tell you, on a couple of occasions, I've seen some really terrible results of something like this. Number one actually both of these examples are from last summer. The first one was out in, I want to say it was somewhere in California. I'm trying to recall where it was in particular. It actually was an awful scene. There were a group of bike tourists who were at the same campground, and they left all of their food, not just in their panniers, but in their open panniers, and they just left it out. And I'm sure many of you know what happened next. The raccoons came out. And it just seems like wherever you go camping, there tends to be raccoons because they are the craftiest little devils out there. These folks left their panniers open, but raccoons, as many of you, can get into almost anything. They're devilishly smart. They're really good at unbuckling stuff, and they also happen to have claws and they can get through all sorts of stuff. By the time anybody figured it out, there was food everywhere, and it was a real disaster, and it was embarrassing for the folks who had left the food out there. So I would say leaving it out is even worse, but even in your tent, you're running a risk of raccoons or possum or any of the other variety of different types of wildlife that are out there from getting inside there, and they will get inside there and they will smell it. That's just not an ideal way to go. If you feel like that there's going to be a strong possibility that you're going to be someplace, especially if you're going to be wild camping. I know Mysterious James has been in Alaska, some other places where basically you come off the side of the road and you pitch a tent. What I would recommend, and in fact, what he suggested to me, was to get some smell-proof bags. And I'm going to put a link in the show notes. Again, link in the show notes always going to be the pedalshift.net/episode number. So it's pedalshift.net/015. Go check it out. Link to some smell-proof bags. Now, they are not foolproof. They definitely are better than nothing. But I would strongly recommend that if you are going to be in a situation where you don't think you're going to have a better storage option than in your panniers, I would say get some of these. They're not very expensive. The link I have is to Amazon. You can get them at your local camping store, perhaps even some of your local bike stores as well. They're like really heavy duty Ziploc bags. So picture that. And they do a nice job of keeping the smell away. And if you're going to be traveling in an area with more aggressive critters like bear and things like that, these are the very minimum that you want to be dealing with. If you're talking about big creatures, you're going to be going with something more like a bear canister or something along those lines. Of course, those are going to be more bulky and more difficult to deal with. But when you're dealing with things like grizzlies and stuff like that, you don't want to mess around with that. But at the very least, smell-proof bags. I think those would be very helpful. Then you can feel a little bit more confident leaving food in your tent within those. It's still not ideal, but if that's the best you can do, that's the best you can do, especially if you're going to be into wild camping. I've got a link in the show notes for the next level up. And this would be if you're in a place with a little more aggressive creatures like your bears and things along those lines. You can elevate your bags and you can create like a little rope trick and bring those bags up. There's a whole bunch of these on the internet, and I found one on YouTube that actually I keep going to every time I go touring because I always forget, okay, how do you wrap it around the stick and do all this other stuff? It's actually really helpful, and I think it's a really good way to show how you can elevate a bag with your food up out of the reach of any other creatures out there. Check it out in the show notes. Last but not least, and this is especially if you're in a more organized campsite, use those food boxes when they're available. Now, on busy nights in a hiker biker spot, you may be competing for some small amount of space amongst a lot of bikers, but definitely try to get your most smelly foods into there. It's good stewardship. It's going to protect your food. It's going to protect your gear because there's nothing worse than getting your gear torn apart by an aggressive raccoon. I've seen it. It's gross, and it really sends you off the deep end. Those are sort of the basic ideas out there. Really recommend getting into those smell-proof bags. If you do need to learn some techniques, take a look at that YouTube link about how to elevate your bag up, and definitely use food containers when they've been made available to you. They're there for a reason. And that's it for the lab. All right, new segment on the show, and this is called Gear Talk. I've been talking a little bit on the blog about my favorite touring bikes. Take a look at those. I talked about my bike, which is the Novara Safari. It's my bike of choice, the Surly Long Haul Trucker. And then the third part was basically, what bike do you have in your garage? It's really meant for the people who are starting off doing bike touring and they want to know how to get started. And I say, use your own bike. Use the bike you've got. In most circumstances, you can do that. Take a look at those. Those are all links in the show notes as well. Pedalshift.net/015. On this episode, I want to talk about gearing ratios. This was an area that absolutely baffled me forever. So I am by no means an expert. I think I said in the newsletter that went out this week that I'm an expert at being a dummy on gear ratios because it's totally true. Where do you want to go? SheldonBrown.com. Those of you who don't know the SheldonBrown.com website, get to know this because there's some really great information there. SheldonBrown.com/gears, GEARS. Why? There is a calculator on there, and it's going to help get you to the point where you can understand this at least enough to feel comfortable with it. And that's where I am right now. When I first got my good touring bike, my Novara Safari, it came with, I would say, a less than fully optimal gear ratio. The climbing gear on it wasn't as good as I would have liked it, and I didn't know what to do about that. I knew that I could swap out the crankset. I knew that I could swap out the cassette, but I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know what the numbers meant, and you may be in exactly the same place, and that's what I want to talk about it in this portion of the podcast. Number one, there are a bunch of different ways to measure gearing. The way that I'm going to do it is called gear inches, but there are also gear ratios. The cool thing about gear inches is that you can understand a big number versus a small number. And this calculator that's over at sheldonbrown.com will help allow you to measure those differences. You just throw in essentially what your crankset is, you throw in what your rear cassette is, and you will end up getting the full array of all of your gear options. And you'll be able to see what your quote unquote, your gear inches are for your highest gear, your fastest gear, and then for also your lowest gear. And that's usually a good way to determine whether or not it's how you want your setup to be. Because I know a lot of you are really interested in having some speed and would rather have your higher end be a faster thing. Some of you are more like me, where you would like to be able to climb up a tree if possible and have the granny gear be the climbiest gear possible. And that you're also going to be able to tell from this sheldonbrown.com gear calculator. By the way, there are more than one gear calculator. There's more than one gear calculator site out there. This just happens to be the one that I use. And I think it's also the easiest one to use as well. So let's back up a second here. The higher the gear inches, and again, I'm using gear inches as my measurement, that's going to be the higher the gear. So in other words, that's going to be the biggest chain ring on the smallest cassette gear means you're at your fastest and it's the harder to pedal into, and it's meant for flats, right? Okay. So the lower that number is, the lower of gear inches you have, that's going to be your smaller chainring up front and your biggest one in back on the cassette, right? So that's going to be your climbing gear. That's your granny gear. So it's a little bit, we know when we see it, but explaining it is, I don't know, for some reason, just strange. And visualizing it is also very strange. But when you're in your highest front, your highest pedaling, you're going to be on the big one up front and the little one in the back, and then flip it around. When you're in granny, you're going to be on the little chain ring up front and the biggest one in the back. Okay, so picture all that. Now, the number of teeth that are on these is going to basically give you your gear inches, and that's what this gear calculator figures out for you. So rather than bore you with more details on all of this, what are my recommendations here? First off is that if you don't have a triple on your front, that's something that I really like having. It just gives you more options. So that means that you have 3 rings up front on your crankset. I happen to 44, 32, 22 on a typical 9 speed. And what do those numbers mean? Again, it's the number of teeth. So 44 is the largest chainring, down to 22 on the smallest one, and 32 being in the middle. You'll live most of the time on that middle chainring, and you can figure out what the gear inches are based on what your cassette is in the back. I found that is the easiest way to get sort of bang for the buck in terms of making your bike a little more climby if you want it. And that's what I happen to want. That's also a very typical mountain bike setup. Many touring bikes actually are a little less climby than that. So for instance, the Safari stock comes with a totally different one, which isn't as climby, and I happen to like that. So I found after I made that swap out, when I compared on the gear calculator, I was able to see that my lowest gear, my granny gear, had a much better gear inches rating. It was lower, and I totally felt the difference. And if you're finding you're having trouble getting up hills, or you find like you're really pressing into your pedals, this might be the one simple change that you can make. Now, you don't have to make it just on your crankset. You can also do it on your cassette. So if your rear cassette is getting a little bit worn down, it might be time to change that out. Start thinking about maybe what would be a good cassette to put on there. Figure out what the gear inch ratings are using that calculator. That can really help you out a lot. I just did some work on my bike and actually replaced the cassette and made that actually a notch more climby as well. And I replaced that out. There's a great video, link in the show notes again, from a guy. This is a good name for a YouTube channel, All Around Math Guy. And he talks a lot about gear ratios, and you can learn a little bit more from somebody who knows a little bit more than I do about the math side of things. But the basic idea here is go plug in what you've got right now. Plug it into the Sheldon Brown calculator. take a look, and then compare what you've got available. So if you're ever looking to swap out some stuff, if you are dissatisfied with where you're at right now, you've got the power. You can just swap out a couple of components, and usually for a pretty inexpensive amount of money, swapping out a cassette, swapping out your crank, you're actually going to be able to have a totally different ride. And that really might help you for whatever your next tour is, especially if you've either wanted to be able to do something a little bit faster, or if you've been dreading a particular climb that's on your next tour. This is the type of thing that you can use to help you be able to get up those hills a little bit easier. It worked for me. I think it'll work for you as well. Thank you for joining. You can find Pedalshift at pedalshift.net for more great bicycle touring content. You can hear the Pedalshift project through Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast app. Opening music courtesy of Jason Kent off his self-titled album. The track is called America. Check out his band Sunfield's latest release, Mono Mono, wherever cool music is available.